In every city, there are stories that never made the papers. Not because they weren't important, but because they were inconvenient. They live in forgotten files, in half-finished investigations, in questions no one wanted answered. This isn't where justice always wins. This is where the echoes remain. This is Reverberating Noir. Some men are so dangerous that the world itself seems to exhale when they're gone. But here's the thing about that kind of man. The world never quite figures out who did the exhaling.
A shot through a parlor window, children in the room. A man who had survived battlefields, exile, and the collapse of everything he believed in dead before the newspaper hit the floor. And not a single person was ever charged.
Welcome to Reverberating Noir. I'm Adam Jones.
And I'm Nina Jovovich. Tonight, we're going back to 1868, Helena, Arkansas, a river town holding its breath, and a killing that the state of Arkansas decided, very quietly, it did not want to solve.
The man in the chair was Thomas Carmichael Hindman Jr., general, congressman, exile, and by the autumn of 1868, one of the most hated men in a state full of people who had very good reasons to hate him.
What makes this case genuinely disturbing isn't the violence. It's the silence that followed. A reward was offered, accusations were made, and then nothing. The case simply stopped.
Let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand the night of September the 27th, 1868, you have to understand the decades of fire that led to it.
Thomas Hindman was born on January the 28th, 1828, in Knoxville, Tennessee. Raised in Alabama, trained as a lawyer. And from almost the first moment he opened his mouth in a courtroom or on a political stage, he was the kind of man who made enemies the way other men made friends. Effortlessly, instinctively.
He moved to Arkansas, got himself elected to Congress in 1858, and in Washington he found his people. They called them the Fire Eaters. Southern Democrats who didn't just defend slavery, they preached it. They wanted confrontation. They wanted secession. And Hindman was one of the loudest voices in that room.
Here's what's worth pausing on. Hindman wasn't a man who drifted into radicalism. He ran toward it. Every position he took to the extreme. Every argument he made at full volume. That's a particular kind of personality. And that kind of personality tends to generate a particular kind of consequence.
When the war came, he didn't hesitate. Resigned his seat, went home, started raising soldiers, fought at Shiloh in April of 1862, got wounded, got promoted, and then he was handed something that would define him for the rest of his life and beyond it, command of the Trans-Mississippi Department.
Which sounds like a military appointment, but what it actually was a license.
Arkansas was crumbling. Federal forces were pressing in from multiple directions. The Confederate supply chain was failing. The men were exhausted, underfed, and deserting in numbers that couldn't be ignored. And Hindman looked at all of that and declared martial law.
He conscripted every able-bodied man he could find. He seized civilian property, food, clothing, weapons, and redirected it to his army. He ordered deserters executed. He ordered Union sympathizers executed, without trial, without appeal, without what most people would recognize as due process of any kind.
Now, you can make a military argument for some of that. He was trying to hold a state together with almost nothing. And for a time it worked. He built an army out of near collapse. But the cost is what matters here.
Because every man he conscripted had a family. Every farm he stripped had a family behind it. Every execution he ordered without trial left someone behind. A brother, a son, a father. People who didn't forget. People who had 6 years between 1863 and 1868 to decide what they were going to do about it.
They called it Hindman's War. Not the Civil War, not the Confederate cause, his war. That's how personal it was. That's how deeply people felt that what he'd done wasn't military necessity, it was something closer to tyranny.
He was relieved of command in 1863 after a series of military setbacks, including a difficult engagement at Prairie Grove. And the war ground on without him in that particular role. But the enemies he'd made in Arkansas, they didn't go anywhere.
The war ended badly for the South, and for Hindman, it ended with something very specific, the very real possibility of arrest and prosecution. So he did what a certain kind of man does when the walls close in. He ran
Mexico. He tried to establish a colony there with other Confederate exiles. It didn't work. Mexico was not interested in becoming a refuge for the remnants of a failed rebellion, so he came back, first to Mississippi. Then, in 1867 to Helena, Arkansas.
He came home to a state that had been fundamentally transformed. Arkansas was under Republican control. Reconstruction was in full force. The 14th Amendment had been ratified. Freedmen had legal rights, political rights. The state militia included black soldiers, and the political atmosphere was something close to a slow-motion war.
This is where the case gets genuinely complicated, because Hindman didn't come back quietly. He never did anything quietly. He re-entered the political arena immediately, positioning himself as a leader of the conservative Democratic opposition. His explicit goal was to dismantle Reconstruction and restore white political dominance in Arkansas. He called it redemption. The Republicans called it what it was, a direct threat to everything they'd built.
And here's the thing about being a direct threat in 1868 Arkansas. It wasn't a metaphor. The Ku Klux Klan was active across the state. Violence between white conservatives and black militia members was a recurring reality. Everyone was armed. Everyone was angry. And the line between political opposition and open warfare had become very, very difficult to locate.
Hindman walked back into that environment with both eyes open, and he made no effort to lower his profile. He was campaigning, organizing, speaking. Being exactly the kind of visible, vocal, dangerous to someone target that tends to attract a particular kind of attention.
September the 27th, 1868. A Tuesday evening, Hindman is at home with his family, the parlor, lamplight, children nearby, a newspaper in his hands.
The house was situated close to the street. The parlor windows offered a clear view of the interior. Someone, or more than one someone, knew that.
Around 8 or 9 in the evening, under the cover of darkness, a gun barrel came through the window. One shot, devastating. The children were physically unharmed. Their father was not.
He didn't die immediately. He lingered through the night and died on September the 28th, 1868. The assassin, or assassins, were already gone. No trace, no witnesses who would speak.
A reward was offered. Accusations flew in every direction. And then silence.
This is the part I keep coming back to. Because the silence isn't just an absence of information, it's a choice. Somewhere in Helena, in the weeks and months after that shot, people knew things. In a town that size, in 1868, in a political environment that charged people always know things. The question is why that knowledge never became a charge, never became a trial, never became a conviction.
Let's talk about the suspects, because the list is remarkable, and not in a way that narrows anything down.
You have the Republican political establishment, who had every reason to see Hindman as a threat to their hold on the state. You have the Union League, a pro-Republican organization with significant black membership whose name came up in the whispers that followed. You have members of the state militia. You have radical Republicans at the state government level. Any one of those groups had motive. Any one of them had access to people willing to act on that motive.
And then there's the other possibility, the one that tends to get less attention.
Hindman's war. 6 years earlier, every man he conscripted, every farm he stripped, every execution he ordered without trial, those people were still in Arkansas in 1868. Their families were still there. Their grief was still there, and official channels had given them absolutely nothing in the way of justice or acknowledgement.
There's something almost inevitable about that when you sit with it long enough. Hindman built a career on the idea that certain rules didn't apply to him. That power justified the methods used to hold it, and in the end someone applied that same logic to him.
What I find most disturbing about this case isn't the killing itself, it's the systemic failure around it. A man is assassinated in his own home, in front of his children, in a town where everyone knew who he was and why someone might want him dead. And the investigation produces nothing. Not a lack of suspects, not a lack of motive, a lack of will.
Because solving this murder would have required someone to make a choice about which story they wanted to be true. If the killer was a Republican operative, that's a scandal that could bring down the Reconstruction government. If the killer was a former victim of Hindman's wartime brutality that opens a conversation about accountability for things the Confederacy did that nobody in power wanted to have, either way, the truth was inconvenient. And inconvenient truths in 1868 Arkansas had a way of staying buried.
His death was immediately weaponized. For his political allies, he became a martyr proof that the Republican regime was corrupt and murderous. For his enemies, his death was a problem solved. And in both cases, the actual question of who pulled that trigger became secondary to what his death could be made to mean. That's a pattern. And it's a pattern that didn't end in 1868.
Here's what most people miss when they encounter this case. They focus on the politics, the Reconstruction drama, the Confederate legacy, and all of that matters. But underneath all of it, there are children who watched their father die, who spent the rest of their lives knowing that whoever did it walked free, and that the world had collectively decided that was acceptable.
That's the part that doesn't get resolved. Not in 1868, not now. The identity of the assassin is still, genuinely, one of the great, unsolved mysteries of the Reconstruction era. And I think that matters. Not because Hindman was a sympathetic figure, he wasn't by any reasonable measure, but because a society that decides certain murders don't need solving based on who the victim was, or who the killer might embarrass that society is telling you something very specific about how it values accountability.
The lamp was still burning in the parlor. The children were still in the room. And somewhere in the Helena night, whoever came to that window was already gone. Already folding back into a town that had decided, for its own complicated reasons, not to look too hard.
A reward was offered. Accusations were made. The case stopped. And 157 years later, it hasn't moved.
Thomas Hindman lived by a very simple philosophy, that the rules were for other people, that power justified the methods used to hold it, that certain questions didn't need to be asked if the outcome was already decided. And in the end, the world that killed him operated by exactly the same logic. There's a kind of grim symmetry in that, the kind that doesn't comfort anyone, the kind that just sits there. Quiet, unresolved, reverberating. If this case left something sitting with you, that feeling that the story isn't finished, that something important is still missing, that's exactly why we're here. Subscribe to Reverberating Noir. Every episode, we go looking for the cases that the world decided to stop asking questions about, the ones that didn't get solved, the ones that got buried, the ones that are still, in some quiet and unsettling way, alive. Hit subscribe. Leave us a comment. Tell us what you think happened in that Helena parlor. On September the 27th, 1868, we read every one.
One shot. No trial, no conviction. A reward offered and never claimed. A list of suspects long enough to fill a courtroom and a courtroom that never convened. The most disturbing thing about this case isn't that we don't know who did it. It's that someone, somewhere, decided we weren't supposed to find out. And they were right.
The recording ends here, but the case doesn't. Somewhere, the evidence still exists. The questions still wait. If this story stayed with you, if it followed you into the silence, subscribe to Reverberating Noir. Not for us, for the stories that refuse to disappear.
Because as long as something doesn't make sense, the truth is still out there. And someone will find it.
Until next time, keep listening to the dark.